Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Peter Tabuns. I'm the Ontario NDP critic for energy and climate action. I'm joined this morning on the stage by Lise Bourgeois from Thunder Bay, Sandy Shaw, MPP from Hamilton, my colleagues Jessica Bell, Chandra Pasma, and Dr. Jennifer Penny from Seniors for Climate Action Now. We are going to be introducing a new bill today, the Ontario Climate Change and Resilience Act, legislation to ensure that the province is prepared for future extreme weather events and disasters that we are going to see coming out of the climate crisis. As everyone is aware, thousands of Canadians already in the past month have been driven from their homes by wildfires that have been charged by the climate crisis. We have to face the reality. The Ford Conservatives are fiddling while the world burns, and we can't afford to do that. We actually have to take action now to protect ourselves, to make our society more resilient, to adapt to the changing world. Our bill gives Ontario the powers, the plans it needs to actually adapt and protect people. And it's written using the studies that have been done by the provincial government and ignored by them. The material's there, the information's there. If they want to act, they've already got it. We put it together in a comprehensive package. Acting today will save lives and will save money. You wouldn't wait for your house to burn down to call the fire department. We're saying call the fire department now. We're in a growing climate crisis. We have to take action to reduce that risk, cut costs, save lives. I want to note, before I turn the podium over to the environment critic, Sandy Shaw, that we owe a great debt to Seniors for Climate Action Now, and in particular Dr. Penny, for the huge amount of work they did pulling things together for this bill. Really, they were critical. And with that, MPP Shaw.
Thank you very much, Peter. This is really an important bill, given that this government has absolutely no climate action plan and really have their heads in the sand. And as we see wildfires burning in Western Canada, we need to see action now. I would say really that the climate crisis we know means more local storms, and people are at greater risk. Their homes, people's lives could be put at risk. And, waiting will just put more people's lives and more people's property at risk. And a huge piece of this is we must restore the powers of the conservation authorities across Ontario. The Ford government has kneecapped conservation authorities in their ability to protect wetlands that provide a buffer from the floods that we're seeing. So that is an important piece of climate adaptation that we need conservation authorities to be able to do the important work that they have been doing since Hurricane Hazel to keep communities and keep us safe. And so this bill will go a long way to presenting a plan that we need, and we need action now. And thank you very much for your attention to this important bill, and thank you to SCAN as well for your important work on this.
And we'll turn it over to Dr. Penny.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everybody, and thank you, Peter. When Peter asked for SCAN's help in writing the private member's bill on adapting to climate change in Ontario, we said yes, despite a very short deadline. And we did that because the climate crisis we are in demands rapid action from us and from the government. A primary responsibility of government is to safeguard its citizens, including from climate change impacts. These impacts were clearly laid out in the provincial climate change impact assessment that was quietly released by this government last summer. We need protection for seniors who are more likely to die in extreme heat, as was seen in the British Columbia heat dome a few years ago, for tenants in baking apartments, for road workers, roofers, and migrant farm workers who are working in extreme heat, for Indigenous people who are repeatedly evacuated from flooded communities, for children whose asthma is aggravated by wildfire smoke, for farmers whose crops are decimated by drought, and homeowners who lose their roofs to tornadoes. The Ontario Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Act, being tabled today, contains more than 50 practical adaptation actions that were recommended, as Peter said, in reports commissioned by the government several of which have never been released publicly, but which SCAN was able to get released to us by multiple Freedom of Information requests. And these are posted on SCAN's website. They're not yet posted on the government's website. But as I said, in this act, we've included more than 50 practical adaptation actions the government can take around extreme heat, around flooding, around wildfires, around intense storms, and for infrastructure, for agriculture, and for the natural environment. I encourage the reporters in the room to read and report on these specific sets of actions because it's what we really need to see now. So we call on this government to heed these reports and to have our backs and to pass this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Penny. Are there any questions?
Yes. You guys are saying that there's not really any initiatives coming from the government in regards to climate change, but there are initiatives that have been put up for emergency preparedness, and there is a community grant that has been talked about through Treasury Board to prepare communities for this type of emergency. So why is your initiative better or more important than the one that's been proposed by the government?
Well, from what we've seen, we have not actually seen a response at the scale that's required, given the scope of the crisis that's coming at us, and in fact that we're already in. As my colleague Sandy Shaw said, we need to have restoration of the powers of the conservation authorities if we're going to protect people from flooding. We're not seeing that. In fact, we're seeing further reduction in their ability to protect people from flooding. We're not seeing action on their part to put out the floodplain maps to let people know that they're at risk and in peril. What we've seen from the government is minor, and what we need is major.
And when it comes to this point, when it comes to money, how much would be necessary as opposed to what's already being?
Well, the bill actually requires the government to put a plan together so that we can get a sense of what the budget is. But it was very clear from the Financial Accountability Office and their study of Ontario infrastructure that spending many billions of dollars now to protect our infrastructure would be something would save many, many more billions in the future trying to rebuild that infrastructure after it's washed away.
You guys mentioned restoring powers of conservation authorities, floodplain mapping, but wondering if you could talk about some other things that are in this bill, some of these 50 things.
Jennifer, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. 50 things getting hard to remember as a senior, I have to say. We included, for example, the Ontario Building Code needs to build in protections for homes. One of the things that is very, very simple, for example, that the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction has been trying for about 15 years to get into the Ontario Building Code, is a requirement for something called a hurricane strap. It's a little tiny piece of equipment that attaches the side walls of a building to the roof, and it prevents these strong winds that we're finding coming in, the derechos, the tornadoes, the winds that are uplifting from taking the roofs off buildings. We saw it in Barrie and in Vaughan in the last couple of years. There's been a number of instances where 100 or more homes had their roofs torn off. So a simple kind of change to the Ontario Building Code, and it's been resisted for all this time. In fact, at the federal level, the Canadian Standards Association has been passing a whole series of new standards, but they have to be adopted by the province, and this is for all kinds of infrastructure as well as for buildings. And what we really need to see the government taking these standards and putting them into law. They need to be considering with respect to infrastructure, for example. Infrastructure is built. Infrastructure lasts 40, 50, 60 years in many instances. You build a bridge, you want it to last a while. If you a culvert for a stream that's coming under a particular road has to be planned, thinking not about what the weather was like 30 years ago, which is what the situation now, but what the weather is likely to be 20 years from now as storms increase in their intensity and so on. So those are some of the kinds of things that we'd like to see in the legislation. With respect to the Emergency Act, I think it's great that improvements are being made in the Emergency Act, and that is really important. But what we have, most of the actions here that we're looking at in this bill are preventive. We don't want to have all of these emergencies occurring, or emergencies where you're having to evacuate communities from flooding and so on. So what we need to do is to look at what you can do to prevent it so that your emergency alerts don't have to go into effect. I hope that's helpful.
Wouldn't a lot of this stuff just significantly raise the cost of infrastructure, cost of homes and whatnot?
Well, again, Peter mentioned the Financial Accountability Office did a study of 3 sets of infrastructure in Ontario, did several studies actually, and they showed that waiting for infrastructure to get damaged in floods and storms and so on, and then building it up again is actually much more expensive than proactively adapting infrastructure to the kinds of climate conditions that are coming down the tube. So the government itself has those reports. The Financial Accountability Office showed what the figures were. Those figures have also come out more recently. The Canadian Climate Institute at the federal level has also done a recent set of reports about the damages from climate change and the price of fixing those damages versus preventive action to adapt infrastructure, and there's just no comparison.
This one could be for anyone. You guys are saying Tories come out, or there's legislation that requires Tories to come out with report and make plans and whatnot, but they bury them, they don't release them. You have to file FOIs. So why would this be any different? Assuming it passes.
If I could speak to that, I think that simply accepting that they're going to ignore the climate crisis and ignore measures necessary to protect people is not a useful strategy. We need to make this far more visible. We need to make sure people know that the preventive action that could be taken to protect them is not happening. And that's part of what you have to do to build political momentum on the issue.
And sir, were those FOIs that you mentioned earlier, are those, did you newly post those, or have these been around for a bit?
Well, we actually got the several reports released to us, and they're on our website now. The government has never put them on their own website. There's one is the Adaptation Best Practices Report. It was done by the same group that did the Provincial Climate Change Impacts Assessment that was released last August, although the government sat on it for 7 months first. But it was released. Then they did a major adaptation best practices reports, 400 and some odd pages, that outlines all the different ways in which governments at different levels in different jurisdictions have implemented preventive strategies for this whole range of issues. So that was one that was really important. The other thing that this government commissioned in 2019 was the report by an advisory committee on climate change, and the report was released in 2021, but again was never released, and that involved a number of people who've been involved in adaptation in Ontario for many, many years and knew what they were talking about. As far as I know, none of the recommendations from either of those reports has been put into place. It's possible that the government is considering that behind closed doors, but we don't know of those things that are happening.
I'm good.
Are there any other questions? No? None? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Picture too?
Yes.
Sure,
yes.
why not?
Sure.